I have seen many things in my lifetime, but nothing haunts me more than the night they dragged Obinna through the village square, blood dripping from his nose, his once strong legs too weak to stand. He had fought many battles in the wrestling ring, but this was different. This was not sport. This was punishment. The king had finally gotten what he wanted. And Princess Adaeze, she stood at the palace balcony, her white wrapper stained with tears, watching as they took away the only man she had ever loved. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning. I am Okezzy, the son of the town crier. My father's voice carried through the 7 villages of Umuagu, announcing news, market days, and the king's decrees. But I was not destined to be a town crier. I was a boy who loved wrestling, and that is why I was there the day Obinna first arrived. It was the day of the annual wrestling festival. The whole village gathered at the square to watch strong men fight for honor. The best wrestlers from all the nearby villages came to prove themselves. The winner would receive a fattened goat, a yam barn full of tubers, and most importantly, the respect of the elders. The king's men were already seated. The young men of Umuagu were ready. But before the wrestling began, a stranger walked into the square. He was tall and broad-chested, with the body of a man who had seen many battles. His skin glowed with sweat, and when he removed his wrapper and tied it around his waist, the muscles in his arms shifted like waves on the river. "I am Obinna, son of Nwosu from Umuagu," he said in a loud voice. "I have come to wrestle." There was silence. Umuagu was a small village. No one from there had ever won a wrestling match in Umuagu. The young men laughed. They thought it was a joke. "Do you know who you are facing?" One of them, Ekena, asked. "We do not wrestle with weak men here." "I do not see any weak men," Obinna said. "Only men who are afraid." The crowd roared. No one had ever spoken to Ekene like that. The wrestling began. One by one, Obinna threw them to the ground. It was like watching a leopard fight goats. He did not just win, he won easily. The people cheered. They lifted him and sang his name, but not everyone was happy. The king, Eze Uzo, sat on his throne, his face like a rock. His son, Prince Ifeanyi, had also wrestled that day, and he had lost. To Obinna, that was the day everything changed. That was the day Princess Adaeze first laid eyes on the man she would love. I did not know then, but Adaeze had been watching. She had seen how Obinna moved, how he stood like a lion among men. She had seen the way he smiled, the way his voice carried when he spoke, and something in her heart had shifted. Adaeze was the most beautiful girl in all of Umuagu. Every man wanted her, but none could have her. Her father had made it clear. She would marry a prince or a rich man from another kingdom. No commoner was worthy, but their heart does not follow the laws of men. They met in secret. At first, it was by accident. Obinna would be walking through the market square, and Adaeze, hidden under her veil, would pass by. Their eyes would meet, and something unspoken would pass between them. Then the meetings became intentional. In the evenings, when the air was cool, Adaeze would sneak past the palace guards and meet Obinna near the big udala tree. I know this because I was the one who kept watch for them. "Why do you risk so much?" I asked her once. "Because love is a risk," she said simply. And I believed her. The king found out sooner than they expected. One night, as I sat outside my father's hut, I heard voices from the palace. Angry voices. The king was furious. He had heard whispers, and now his spies had confirmed it. His daughter, his precious Adaeze, was in love with a common wrestler. "This is an insult to my throne," he thundered. "A disgrace to our bloodline." The next morning, he sent his guards to find Obinna. But Obinna was not a fool. He had seen the way the king looked at him after the wrestling match. He knew his love for Adaeze would not be welcomed. He had already left the village before the guards could catch him. But Adaeze, she was not so lucky. Her father locked her in the highest room of the palace, refusing to let her out. She would not eat, she would not sleep, she refused to speak to anyone. And so, the king made a decision. If Obinna wanted his daughter, he would have to fight for her. But not in the wrestling ring. A message was sent to Umuagu. If Obinna truly loved Adaeze, he would return and prove his worth. But this was not a normal wrestling match. The king had chosen a fighter, an older man, a warrior who had fought in real battles, not just village games. I knew it was a trap. Everyone did. But Obinna came back anyway. The whole village gathered to watch. The fight was brutal. This was not sport. There were no rules. Punches turned into kicks. Kicks turned into blood. But Obinna refused to fall. He fought like a man with nothing to lose. And then, the final blow, a sharp strike to the ribs. Obinna staggered, fell. The village was silent. The king stood, his face full of triumph. "Take him away," he said. The guards dragged Obinna through the village square, his body battered, his breath shallow. That was the night Adaeze stood at the balcony, watching the only man she had ever loved disappear. Obinna did not die that night. He was left outside the village, broken but alive. The people of Umuagu found him and nursed him back to health. And Adaeze? She never married. She never smiled again. Years later, when the king died and her brother took the throne, she left the palace. Some say she went to Umuagu. Some say she and Obinna ran away together. No one knows for sure. But I like to believe that love, no matter how much it suffers, never truly dies. Years passed. Umuagu changed. The old king, Eze Uzo, was gone, and his son, Ifeanyi, now ruled in his place. But power did not make Ifeanyi a wise king. He was weak, ruled by greed and fear. The people murmured that Umuagu had lost its glory. I had grown older too. My father had passed, and I had taken his place as the town crier. Every morning I walked through the village announcing news. But one morning, something happened that I did not expect. As I stood in the village square, a figure walked into Umuagu. He was taller now, broader, with scars on his arms, like a warrior who had seen many battles. His hair was longer, his eyes sharper, but I knew that face. Obinna had returned. Whispers spread through the village like harmattan wind. Some were afraid, others were excited, but all of them wanted to know, why had he come back? I walked up to him. "Obinna," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled. "Okazi," he said, "I have unfinished business." And I knew. He had come back for Adaeze. Obinna had spent years healing in Umuagu, but he had never forgotten Adaeze. He had searched for news of her, but Umuagu was a place that kept its secrets. No one from Umuagu dared to enter. "I need to see her," he said. I hesitated. "No one knows where she is," I admitted. The last time anyone had seen Adaeze was the day after the old king died. She had left the palace, wearing a simple wrapper, her hair unbraided like a woman in mourning. Some said she had gone to the river. Others said she had walked deep into the forest. Obinna's jaw tightened. "Then I will find her." But before he could, trouble came. King Ifeanyi was not like his father, but he feared the same thing, Obinna. When the palace guards told him that the wrestler had returned, he panicked. He remembered how Obinna had humiliated him in the wrestling ring all those years ago. He remembered how Adaeze had loved him, and worst of all, he remembered that the people had loved Obinna too. "Find him," he told his guards, "and this time, finish what my father started." Obinna was not a fool. He knew they would come for him, so he disappeared into the forest, hiding in the shadows, waiting, and that was when he found her. She was not in the river, she was not in the forest, but she was close. Adaeze had been living in a small hut, deep in the outskirts of the village. She had nothing but a mat, a pot, and the clothes on her back. But when Obinna saw her, she was still the most beautiful woman he had ever known. She turned when she heard footsteps, and for a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then she whispered, "Obinna?" He stepped closer. "It's me." She rushed into his arms, and for the first time in years, Adaeze wept. She wept for the life they had lost, for the years they had spent apart, for the love that had never died. "I thought you were dead," she said between sobs. "I should have been," he admitted, "but I had to live, for you." They held each other, two broken hearts trying to become whole again. But time was not on their side. The king's guards found the hut before sunrise. Obinna had no weapons, only his hands. But a warrior does not need weapons. When they came for him, he fought. The first guard fell with a broken arm, the second with a shattered rib. The third ran, but there were too many. They held him down, beat him with clubs, dragged him back to the palace. Adaeze ran after them, screaming, but they did not stop. At the palace, King Ifeanyi sat on his father's throne, his lips curled in a cruel smile. "You should have stayed away," he said. Obinna did not answer. His eyes burned with defiance. The king leaned forward. "I will offer you a choice," he said. "Fight for your freedom or die." It was not a fair fight. The king had brought a warrior from another kingdom, a man twice the size of Obinna, a man who had never lost a battle. I watched from the crowd as they brought Obinna into the square. He was tired, wounded, but his spirit was unbroken. Adaeze stood at the edge of the crowd, her hands clenched, her eyes filled with fear. The drums began. The fight started, and once again, Obinna fought. It was brutal. The warrior was strong, but Obinna was faster. Every blow he took, he gave back twice as hard. The people gasped, shouted, cheered. Then, in one swift move, Obinna struck. The warrior fell. The crowd roared. But the king? He was silent. His face was dark with anger. Obinna had won, but the king was not done. A good king would have honored the fight. A good king would have let Obinna go. But Ifeanyi was not a good king. He stood from his throne and raised his hand. The guards stepped forward, their spears pointed at Obinna's chest. Adaeze screamed, "You promised! I promised he could fight," the king said. "I did not promise he would leave." The crowd murmured. This was not right. This was not just. And then Adaeze did something no one expected. She stepped forward, standing between the spears and Obinna. "If you kill him," she said, "you will have to kill me too." The crowd gasped. The guards hesitated. Even the king looked shaken. "You would die for him?" Ifeanyi asked. She lifted her chin. "I would rather die than live without him." Silence. Then something happened. The elders, the chiefs, the warriors, they stepped forward too. "This is not justice," one of them said. "This is not how kings should rule," said another. The people of Umuagu, the same people who had once feared the king, had seen enough. They had suffered enough. And at that moment, Ifeanyi knew he had lost. That night, Obinna and Adaeze left Umuagu. They did not stay to see what happened to the king. They did not wait to see if the people would rise against him. They walked together, hand in hand, into the night. Where they went, I do not know. Some say they crossed the great river and built a new life in another land. Others say they returned to Umuagu and ruled in peace. But I like to believe they found a place where love was stronger than pride, where kings could not control hearts, and where wrestlers and princesses could be together without fear. And that is the story of the princess and the wrestler. Some call it a legend, some call it history. But I was there, and I remember. Obinna and Adaeze walked far from Umuagu, leaving behind the land that had tried to destroy their love. They walked through thick forests, crossed rivers, and traveled under the scorching sun, searching for a place where they could live in peace. At night, they rested under the stars. Adaeze would lie, with her head on Obinna's chest, listening to his heartbeat. "Where will we go?" she asked one night. Obinna stroked her hair. "Somewhere new," he said. "Somewhere no one will tell us who we can love." They found a village by the great river, a place where no one knew their names. The people welcomed them as strangers, giving them food and shelter. Obinna worked in the farmlands, his strong hands turning the soil. Adaeze learned to weave baskets, her fingers moving with skill. For the first time in years, they were free. But freedom does not erase the past. One evening, as they sat by the river, an old man from the village approached them. His face was lined with wisdom, his eyes sharp with knowledge. "You are not just travelers," he said. "I see it in the way you walk. You are running from something." Obinna met his gaze. "We are running from a king." The old man nodded. "Then it is time to stop running. I was there when Ifeanyi tried to escape. He ran through the back of the palace, but the people caught him. The same people who had once bowed before him now dragged him to the square. "You are no longer our king," an elder declared. The people cheered. The throne of Umuagu was empty. And so, for the first time in history, the village chose a new ruler. Not through bloodline, but through wisdom. They chose a leader who would listen, and Umuagu was free. News of Ifeanyi's fall spread quickly. Obinna and Adaeze heard it from a passing traveler. They sat in silence for a long time, letting the words settle in their hearts. Then Adaeze turned to Obinna. "It is time to go home." They traveled back to Umuagu, not as outcasts, but as people returning to the land they loved. When they arrived, the village gathered to welcome them. The elders stood before them, their faces full of respect. "Obinna," one of them said, "you left as a wrestler, but you return as a leader." And so, the people asked him to stay, not as a warrior, but as a guide, a protector of the village. Obinna and Adaeze built a home in the heart of Umuagu. They had children, strong sons, and wise daughters. The village flourished under their wisdom. And the story of the wrestler and the princess became a tale told for generations. A story of love, of struggle, and of a kingdom that chose justice over power. I tell you this story not as a myth, but as a truth I lived, because I, Okezi, was there. And I remember